I met her on the worst night of my career. A gunshot victim. A code blue. Chaos everywhere. Then she walked in and the room went still. "I need you to trust me," she said. I didn't know trusting her would cost me everything. 6 months later. My father stood in that same hallway. He looked at me like he didn't recognize his daughter. What happened between that first night and this one changed my life forever. My name is Dana Coleman, and I am an emergency room nurse in Nashville, Tennessee. I grew up in a house where love had rules, and I had spent my whole life trying to follow them. I was 29 years old, engaged to a good man named Tom, and terrified of a truth I had buried so deep I almost believed it was gone. Her name was Sloan Whitaker, and she arrived at Baptist Memorial on a Tuesday in March. Sloan transferred from a hospital in Seattle, and the rumor mill said she was the best trauma physician the board had hired in a decade. I didn't care about rumors. I cared about getting through my shift. The first time I saw her, she was elbow deep in a chest wound, calling out orders like she'd been born doing it. Her hands didn't shake. Mine did. And she noticed. "You're new to trauma," she said afterward. Not unkindly. "You held your ground in there. Most people freeze the first time." I told her I'd been an ER nurse for 6 years. "Then you're better than most people I've worked with," she said, and walked away before I could figure out why my chest felt tight. I told myself it was adrenaline. Tom called that night, asking about wedding venues. I said the barn on Route 9 was fine, though I couldn't remember what the barn on Route 9 even looked like. My mother had already picked the flowers. Peonies. Because peonies were respectable. My father, a pastor at Grace Hill Baptist, had already written most of the sermon he'd give at my wedding. Everything about my life was decided before I'd been asked. I told myself that was normal. I told myself a lot of things that year that weren't true. Sloan and I ended up on the same rotation for a month straight. She corrected my technique twice, complimented my instincts once, and never once made me feel small for either. "You're sharper than you let people see," she told me over vending machine coffee at 3 a.m. "Why do you hide it?" I didn't have an answer that night. I would later. We started eating lunch together in the break room, then in the stairwell when the break room got too loud. Small things. Nothing that should have mattered. Everything mattered. I noticed I was choosing shifts based on her schedule before I admitted that to myself. That was the first lie I told myself that spring. It would not be the last. Sloan laughed at something I said in triage. A real laugh. Head back. And I felt it land somewhere under my ribs I hadn't used in years. I excused myself to the supply closet. I stood there gripping a shelf of gauze, breathing like I'd run a marathon, furious at my own body for reacting to a woman who was simply being kind to me. "You okay?" Sloan asked through the door. I said I was fine. She didn't believe me, but she let it go, which somehow made it worse and better at once. I started noticing details I had no business noticing. The way she tucked her pin behind her ear. The scar on her left hand. How she hummed old country songs during slow shifts. One night we worked a pediatric case that went badly. The child didn't make it. Sloan found me crying in the stairwell afterward and sat down beside me without a word. "You're allowed to feel this," she said, "when I apologize for falling apart. The day it stops hurting is the day you should quit." I believed her more than I believed most sermons. She drove me home that night because I was too shaken to drive myself. In the car, she asked about Tom. I talked about him the way you talk about a job, not a man. "Do you love him?" she asked. Eyes on the road. I said of course. Too quickly. And she didn't push. But something in her face told me she'd heard the lie anyway. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed replaying her voice, her hands on the wheel. The careful way she'd looked at me like she already knew something I hadn't said aloud. My mother called the next morning, asking about bridesmaid dresses. I answered in monosyllables while staring at my ceiling, wondering why the thought of Sloan felt more urgent than my own wedding. I told myself it was friendship. Deep friendship. The kind you find with people who see you in your worst moments. I had never had a friendship that felt like drowning before. Weeks passed. Sloan and I fell into an easy rhythm. Coffee before shifts. Texts about nothing. Inside jokes about our worst patients. I looked forward to work in a way I never had. Tom noticed I was different. "You seem happier lately," he said one night. And I felt sick. 'Cause he was right. And it had nothing to do with him. I started picking fights with Tom over small things. Testing whether I even wanted this life I'd been building since I was 22. He never fought back. He just got quieter. One night at a bar with coworkers, Sloan leaned close to be heard over the music, and her hand rested on my arm for 3 seconds too long. Neither of us moved away. "I like you, Dana," she said later, when the others had gone. "I've liked you since the gunshot case." I wasn't going to say anything, but I'm tired of pretending I don't. I froze. 29 years of careful walls came down in one sentence. "I have a fiancé," I said, which wasn't a no. And we both knew it wasn't a no. "I know," Sloan said quietly. "I'm not asking you to choose anything tonight. I just needed you to know the truth, even if you never do anything with it." I went home and sat in my car outside my apartment for an hour. Engine off. Hands on the wheel. Feeling something crack open inside me that I couldn't put back. For the first time in my adult life, I let myself imagine a different future. It terrified me more than any trauma case I'd ever worked. I didn't sleep again that week. I avoided Sloan for 4 days, requesting different shifts, taking the long way to the supply room. She let me have the space, which somehow made me miss her more. On the 5th day, we were assigned the same code together. No way around it. Our hands brushed passing an instrument, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath with me. After the patient stabilized, Sloan pulled me into the stairwell. "I'm not going to chase you," she said. "But I needed you to know I meant what I said." "I don't know how to do this," I told her honestly. "I don't know how to be who you think I am," she said. "You don't have to know yet. Just be honest." That night I broke off my engagement to Tom. I didn't mention Sloan. I told him I needed to figure out who I was, which was truer than anything I'd said in months. Tom cried. And I cried too, because he was a good man who deserved someone who wasn't lying to herself. Ending it felt like losing a limb and finally breathing at once. My mother called within the hour. Tom's mother having already spread the news through their prayer group. "What is wrong with you?" she asked. Not as a question but an accusation. I told her I wasn't ready for marriage. It was easier than the truth. I was learning that lies came in layers, and I'd only peeled back the first one. I didn't tell Sloan about the engagement for 2 weeks. When I finally did, over coffee in her car, she just reached over and took my hand without saying a word. "Take your time," she said. "I've waited this long. I can wait a little more." I studied her face and realized I had never felt so completely seen by another person. We started spending time outside the hospital, hiking trails outside Nashville, cooking terrible pasta in her tiny kitchen, laughing until my stomach hurt in a way it hadn't in years. I learned Sloan had been married once, to a man named Daniel, who died in a car accident 4 years earlier. She hadn't dated anyone seriously since. I was the first. "I spent 3 years thinking loving you would mean I never really loved him," she told me one night. "I don't believe that anymore. But it took time to get here." I told her about growing up in Grace Hill Baptist, about sermons on Sunday that made it clear what kind of person I was allowed to become. She listened without judgment. "Your father sounds like he's scared of something," she said once. People that rigid are usually protecting themselves from a memory, not just a belief. I didn't understand what she meant yet. The first time we kissed was in her kitchen, flour on both our hands, laughing about a collapsed lasagna. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Certain. Like something finally arriving home. "I've wanted to do that since the gunshot case," Sloan admitted, resting her forehead against mine. "Me too," I whispered. and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. For the first time, I wasn't performing a version of myself built for other people's comfort. I was simply Dana, standing in a kitchen, in love. And it felt like relief. We kept our relationship quiet at first, unsure how the hospital or my family would react. Stolen moments in the stairwell became our language, small and sacred and entirely our own. I started smiling more at work. Coworkers noticed. My mother noticed something different in my voice on the phone, though she couldn't name what it was. I wasn't ready to name it either. Sloan never pushed me to come out before I was ready. "This is your story," she said. "I'm just grateful to be part of a chapter of it." I fell harder every day. For 3 months, we lived in a careful, private happiness, learning each other's coffee orders, bad habits, and the shape of comfortable silence. I had never known love could feel this steady. Then Kayla Simmons, a nurse on our floor, saw us leaving Sloan's apartment together one morning. She didn't say anything to my face. She didn't need to. Her smile told me enough. Kayla had wanted the trauma coordinator position Sloan got instead of her. And I realized too late that she'd been looking for a reason to hurt one of us for weeks. 2 days later, hospital administration called Sloan and me into separate meetings. An anonymous complaint alleged a conflict of interest, since Sloan occasionally supervised my shifts as attending physician. "It's not against policy," Sloan told me afterward. Jaw tight. "But it doesn't have to be against policy to cost us both something." I felt the ground shift under my feet. Administration decided to separate our schedules permanently, citing professional boundaries. We went from working every shift together to barely overlapping at all. The hospital had found a way to punish us quietly. I confronted Kayla in the break room. She didn't deny it. "I didn't out you," she said coldly. "I just reported facts. What you do with those facts is your problem." I went home shaking with anger I didn't know where to put. Sloan found me on my porch that night. "This is what it costs sometimes," she said gently. "I'm sorry I didn't warn you." "Warn me about what?" I asked. "That loving you would mean losing control of my own life story?" The words came out sharper than I meant them, and I saw her flinch. We had our first real fight that night. Not about each other, but about fear. About who got to decide when and how our truth became public. Neither of us won. I didn't call her for 3 days. I told myself I needed space to think. But really I was scared. And scared people push away the things they need most. My mother called during that silence, saying a member of her prayer group had heard concerning rumors about me and a doctor at the hospital. My stomach dropped through the floor. "Is it true?" she asked. Voice flat. I said nothing, which was its own answer. She hung up without another word, and I sat on my kitchen floor until the sun came up. My father called the next morning. "Come to dinner Sunday," he said, voice tight with forced calm. "We need to talk about this as a family." I knew what that meant. I told Sloan about the dinner invitation. She offered to come with me. I said no. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was walking into. She respected that, though it clearly hurt her. Sunday dinner was silent until dessert, when my father finally spoke. "Is what your mother heard true?" he asked, not looking at me. "Are you involved with a woman?" "Yes," I said. And the word felt like jumping off a cliff I'd been standing on the edge of my entire life. My mother put down her fork and didn't pick it up again. "This isn't how we raised you," my father said, his pastor voice replacing his father voice. "This isn't the life God intended for you." I had heard this sermon before, just never aimed at me. "This is the life I actually have." "Dad," I said, my voice shaking but steady, "I can keep lying to you, or I can be someone you actually know. I choose the second one." My younger brother Micah stayed quiet through all of it, staring at his plate. He was 17, and I could see him trying to memorize a version of me he wasn't sure he'd keep. My father stood up from the table. "I need time," he said. which in our family had always meant silence disguised as patience. I left that night not knowing when I'd be welcome back. Sloan was waiting outside my apartment when I got home, worried I hadn't texted. I told her everything, and she held me while I cried harder than I had in years. I don't regret telling them, I said finally. I just didn't expect it to hurt this much, to be honest. Sloan kissed my forehead. The truth is expensive. It's still worth paying for. Weeks passed with no word from my parents. My mother sent one text. We're praying for you. I didn't know if that meant she loved me or had given up trying to. I threw myself into work instead, picking up extra shifts, avoiding the silence at home. Sloan worried I was using exhaustion to avoid grief, and she wasn't entirely wrong. One night, working alone on a trauma case, I found an old file cabinet in the records room and, oddly, thought of my father. Of the sermons he preached about mercy he rarely practiced. I started digging through boxes of my grandmother's things stored at my apartment, looking for anything that might explain why my father's faith made room for everyone except me. I found a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, tucked into an old Bible, with my grandmother's handwriting on the back. Louise, before everything. Miss you every day. I called my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt Ruth, who was still alive at 86. She told me the truth after decades of family silence. Louise was my father's older sister. Louise was gay, Aunt Ruth said plainly. Your grandfather put her out of the house in 1974. Your father was 12. He watched it happen and never spoke of her again. I sat with that revelation for a long time. My father hadn't invented his fear. He'd inherited it, watched it enacted on someone he loved, and buried it under scripture to survive. It didn't excuse what he'd said to me at that dinner table, but it explained something I hadn't understood before. A wound passed down instead of healed, repeating itself in a new generation. I told Sloan what I'd learned. She was quiet for a long moment. That doesn't make it okay, she said. But it might make it possible to fix, if he's willing to look at it. I decided not to confront my father with it yet. Some truths need the right moment, and I didn't trust either of us to handle it well in the state we were in. Meanwhile, things at the hospital grew worse. Kayla filed a second complaint, this time claiming Sloan had shown favoritism toward me in patient assignments, an accusation with no real evidence behind it. Administration launched a formal review. Sloan was suspended with pay pending the investigation, a professional nightmare disguised as procedure. I watched her carefully built career wobble because of who she loved. I've seen this before, Sloan said bitterly one night. Not this exact thing, but this shape. Someone finds out you're not straight, and suddenly every professional decision you've made looks suspicious. I offered to speak to administration on her behalf, to explain there had never been favoritism, only fairness. She refused. If you get involved, they'll target you too. I won't let that happen. We argued about it for the first time with real heat. You don't get to protect me by disappearing, I told her. That's not partnership. That's just a different kind of hiding. She didn't have an answer for that. We sat in tense silence until she finally said, I'm scared. Dana, I've built my whole life around control, and none of this feels controllable. I understood that fear better than I wanted to admit. Control had been my family's love language too, dressed up as concern, as scripture, as tradition. We were more alike than I'd realized. The investigation dragged into its third week. Rumors spread through the hospital faster than facts. Some coworkers avoided me in the hallway. Others went out of their way to show quiet support. My coworker Priya, who'd known for weeks and never said a word, pulled me aside one shift. For what it's worth, she said, you two are the best team this floor has ever had. The review board scheduled a hearing to determine Sloan's employment status. I asked to testify on her behalf as a colleague, not as her partner, hoping it might carry more weight that way. 2 nights before the hearing, My father showed up at my apartment unannounced. I hadn't seen him in 6 weeks. He looked older. Tired. Like a man carrying something heavy uphill. I found out you know about Louise, he said, standing in my doorway, refusing to come inside. Your great-aunt called me. I need you to understand something before this hearing you mentioned. I let him in. Tasha. Unsure what version of my father I was about to meet. He sat at my kitchen table and stared at his hands for a long time before speaking. I was 12 when my father put Louise out on the porch in the rain, he said, voice cracking in a way I'd never heard from the pulpit. I never saw her again. She died 8 years ago. In Ohio. Alone, he continued. I found out from an obituary a cousin mailed me. I told myself for 40 years that God required what my father did. When you told us at dinner, all I could see was Louise on that porch, he said. I panicked. I reacted like my father. And I hated myself for it the moment I did. I didn't say anything at first. 40 years of inherited fear sat between us on that kitchen table. Heavier than any sermon he'd ever preached at me. Why are you telling me now? I asked. Because I don't want to lose you the way I lost her, he said. I don't know how to undo everything I believe. But I know I don't want silence to win again. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't acceptance yet. But it was the first honest thing my father had said to me in years. And I let myself hold on to that small opening. There's a hearing in 2 days, I told him. For Sloan. The woman I love. If you meant any of what you just said, that would be a place to start. He didn't answer right away. He left without promising anything. And I went to bed that night not knowing whether I just witnessed a beginning or one more disappointment in a long line. The night before the hearing, Sloan and I sat on my porch, going over what I'd say. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I need you to know none of this was a mistake. I know, I said. And I meant it completely. 6 months earlier I hadn't known myself. Now I knew exactly who I was. And I wasn't willing to shrink back down again. We didn't sleep much that night. Holding on to each other like the hearing might somehow decide more than a job. Like it might decide whether the life we'd built could survive contact with the world. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early. Dressed in my nicest scrubs. Prepared to speak the truth in front of strangers holding Sloan's career in their hands. My stomach was in knots. Kayla was there too. Sitting with crossed arms. Refusing to look at either of us. I understood then that this wasn't really about policy for her. It never had been. The board called Sloan first. She spoke calmly about her record. Her patient outcomes. The total absence of favoritism in any documented decision she'd made regarding my assignments over the past year. Then they called me. My hands shook as I sat down. But my voice didn't. Not once I started speaking about the work we did. The lives we'd saved. The truth of who we were. I'm not going to pretend we're not together, I told the board. But being together never once compromised patient care. If anything, it made us both better at our jobs. Sharper. More careful. Kayla was called to clarify her complaints. Under direct questioning, she admitted she had no actual evidence of favoritism, only suspicion born from personal resentment about the coordinator position she'd lost. The doors at the back of the room opened partway through her testimony. I turned and saw my father standing there, still in his church clothes, holding his hat against his chest. He didn't say anything. He simply sat in the back row and stayed for the rest of the hearing, the first time he had ever witnessed any part of my adult life directly. The board deliberated for 2 hours. Sloan and I waited in the hallway, my father sitting a few chairs away. None of us speaking. All of us aware of what was at stake. When the board returned, they cleared Sloan of all wrongdoing, citing insufficient evidence and, notably, a pattern of retaliatory behavior from the original complainant. Kayla was placed under separate review instead. Sloan exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for a month. I hugged her right there in the hallway. not caring who saw. 6 months of careful hiding dissolving in one relieved embrace. My father watched us from his chair. He didn't smile. But he didn't look away either. And for the first time, that felt like something close to progress instead of tolerance. "I'm not ready to stand up in church and announce this," he said quietly, walking me to my car afterward. "But I watched you today. You were braver than I've ever been." "That's enough for now," I told him, surprising myself with how true it felt. Change doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it arrives as a father staying for a hearing he didn't have to attend. Sloan and I celebrated that night with cheap champagne and takeout, laughing at how close we'd come to losing everything over a job that had, in the end, chosen the truth. "Your dad showed up," Sloan said, still processing it. "After everything. He actually showed up." I nodded, unsure yet what it meant, only certain it meant something I couldn't ignore. In the weeks that followed, my father started texting occasionally. Small things, questions about my shifts. Once a photo of Micah's baseball game with a caption that simply said, "He asked about you." My mother remained distant longer, her silence heavier than his had ever been. Faith, for her, wasn't a wound passed down. It was a wall she'd built brick by brick, on purpose. Sloan's professional reputation recovered fully, and the hospital quietly reassigned Kayla to a different floor after a separate complaint from another coworker corroborated a pattern of retaliatory behavior no one had caught before. Life started to feel steady again, ordinary in a way I'd never expected to crave. Shiv. Dinners. Quiet mornings with Sloan. The particular relief of not performing a version of myself for anyone. Then, 3 months after the hearing, Sloan received a call that would test everything we just survived. A hospital in Seattle offered her the trauma director position she'd once dreamed of. "It's everything I wanted 5 years ago," she told me that night, unable to meet my eyes. Before any of this, I felt the floor tilt beneath me again. "You should take it," I said, the words tasting like ash even as I spoke them, because I meant them. Because I loved her enough to mean them, and hated meaning them. "I don't want to go without you," Sloan said. "But I also don't want to be the reason you leave your family right when things are finally starting to heal." We spent 2 sleepless weeks circling the decision, weighing careers against roots, ambition against the fragile new peace I'd built with my father. Neither of us wanted to be the one who asked the other to sacrifice everything. I called my father, unsure why, needing to hear a voice that had known me longest. "What would you do?" I asked him, "if choosing yourself meant losing something you'd spent your life building?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I did that once," he said finally. "I chose my father's approval over my sister. I've regretted it every day since. Don't make my mistake. Dana." "I want you to go," I told Sloan that night. "Not because I don't want to be with you, but because I refuse to be the reason you shrink your own life." "Then come with me," Sloan said simply. "Not because I'm asking you to prove anything. Because I want to build a life with you. And Nashville was never really the point. You were." I sat with that for days, torn between the family I'd only just started rebuilding and the life Sloan was offering me 3 states away. Every option felt like losing something real. I applied for a transfer to Seattle's trauma unit without telling Sloan, unsure if I'd even get an interview, needing to know the choice was mine before I let myself choose it. The interview went well. They offered me a position within a week. Faster than I expected. Faster than I was ready for. I sat with the offer letter for 3 days before answering. I drove to Grace Hill Baptist unannounced, finding my father in his office, sermon notes scattered across his desk. "I got a job offer in Seattle," I told him. "I'm thinking about taking it." He set down his pen slowly. "With her," he said. Not a question. I nodded. He was quiet for a long time, staring at a photo of Louise he now kept on his desk. "I spent 40 years choosing distance," he said finally. I don't get to ask you to stay close so I can finish making up for it. Go live your life. Dana. I mean that. I want you in it. Though, I said. My voice breaking. Not from 3 states away pretending we're fine. Actually in it. Calls. Visits. Honesty. He nodded. Eyes wet. And promised he would try. I told Sloane yes that night. Watching her face crumble with relief before she laughed and cried at the same time. Pulling me into a hug that felt like the start of everything. We gave our notices at the hospital together. 2 weeks apart. Careful not to seem like we were fleeing. Even though part of leaving Nashville really was about finally being free. My mother came to my apartment the week before I left. The first time she'd visited since the dinner where everything broke open. She stood awkwardly in my doorway. Purse clutched tight. I don't understand this, she said. I may never understand it. But your father told me about Louise. And I keep thinking about a girl on a porch in the rain. I'm not asking you to understand it. Mom, I said gently. I'm asking you not to let me disappear the way she did. That's all. Just don't let me disappear. She didn't hug me. She wasn't there yet. But she sat down at my kitchen table and asked, haltingly, about Sloane. About Seattle. About the job. The first real question she'd asked in months. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a door left slightly open instead of slammed shut. And after everything, that small crack of light felt like more than I'd dared to hope for. Packing my apartment felt like packing away an entire version of myself. The one who'd said yes to Tom. The one who'd hidden in supply closets. The one who'd believed love had rules. Sloane found me sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes, holding the old photograph of Louise I'd taken from my grandmother's Bible. I want to bring her with us, I said. Somehow. Symbolically. Then we will, Sloane said, kneeling beside me. We'll build the life she never got to have. That's not sentimental. That's just refusing to let his father win twice. The night before we left Nashville, my father called and asked if he could see me off at the airport. I said yes before I'd finished processing what he was actually offering. Micah came too. 17 and awkward. Hugging me tighter than he ever had. Text me, he said. Not the family group chat. Just me. I want to actually know you. My mother didn't come to the airport. But she'd left a small box on my porch that morning. Inside it my grandmother's cross necklace and a note. For wherever you're going. I love you still. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the wholehearted blessing I once dreamed of as a child. But it was real. Unforced. And after everything we'd survived, real felt like more than enough. My father hugged me at the gate. Stiff and unpracticed. The way men raised in silence hug. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. I should have said that a long time ago. Sloane and I boarded the plane holding hands without a second thought. No supply closets. No careful distance. No performance for anyone watching. It was such a small thing. Felt enormous. Seattle was cold and gray the day we arrived. Nothing like Nashville. And somehow it already felt more honest. A city that had never asked either of us to be anyone else. We found a small apartment near the water. Close enough to the hospital that Sloane could walk to her new office. The one with her name already printed on the door. My first shift at the new trauma center was chaotic. Unfamiliar hallways. Unfamiliar faces. But Sloane's presence down the hall made even the chaos feel like something I could navigate. 6 weeks in. My father called just to talk. No crisis. No confession. Just an ordinary Sunday check-in. It was the most normal conversation we'd had in over a decade. My mother started texting photos from church potlucks. Small domestic things. Casseroles and choir practice. Nothing about my life directly. But a door still propped open. Still trying. Still there. One evening. Sloane came home holding a folder. Her hands trembling slightly. The Seattle Times wants to run a feature on our trauma unit, she said. They want to interview us both. We debated it for days, unsure how visible we wanted to be, how much of our private healing we owed to strangers who might read a headline and decide to hate us for it. In the end, we agreed to a small, honest interview. Less about romance and more about the work. About building a life without apologizing for who shared it with us. The article ran with a photograph of us in scrubs outside the hospital. Captioned simply, "Dir. Sloan Whitaker and RN Dana Coleman. Partners in life and in the trauma bay." I sent the article to my father before it published, unsure how he'd react to seeing it in print. Permanent. Undeniable. Exactly the kind of visibility Louise had never been allowed. He texted back a single line. "You look happy. That's all I ever should have wanted for you." I read it 4 times before I let myself believe it was really from him. A month later, my parents flew to Seattle for the first time in their lives. A trip they'd never once considered taking before I moved 3,000 miles away from them. My mother stood in our small apartment, looking at photographs on the wall. Sloan and me at the beach. At a friend's wedding. Ordinary domestic proof of a life she'd once refused to imagine. "It's a nice apartment," she said finally. Quiet and careful. The closest thing to approval she'd managed to offer since the dinner that had broken everything open a year before. Sloan cooked dinner that night. Nervous in a way I'd rarely seen her. Wanting badly for this to go well. For my parents to see what she and I had built together. My father asked Sloan about her work. Real questions. Engaged in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. Something in his posture had softened since that hearing in Nashville. Over dessert, my mother asked, hesitant, whether Sloan and I had ever thought about marriage. It was the first time either parent had used that word about my relationship without flinching. "We've talked about it," Sloan said, glancing at me. "Whenever Dana's ready." I felt my whole chest warm at the casual, certain way she said it. Like it was simply a fact of our future. That night, after my parents left for their hotel, Sloan and I sat on our balcony overlooking the water. "Marry me," she said suddenly. No ring. No plan. Just the truth spilling out. "Ask me properly sometime," I laughed, my eyes wet. "And I'll say yes." She grinned. "Is that a yes now? Or a yes later?" I kissed her instead of answering, which was answer enough. A week after my parents flew home, a small package arrived from Nashville. Inside was my grandmother's engagement ring, the one that had once been meant for a very different wedding. My mother's note read, "This should have gone to someone your grandmother would be proud of. I think that's you. Both of you." I cried reading it. Harder than I expected to. Sloan proposed properly 2 months later. On the same beach in the photograph my mother had studied so carefully. Kneeling in the sand with my grandmother's ring in her shaking hands. "I don't need the fairy tale version," she said. "I just need you. Exactly like this. For the rest of whatever chaotic, beautiful life we build together." I said yes before she finished. We planned a small wedding. Just close friends. Micah as an usher. My parents in the front row. An image I would never have believed possible standing in that kitchen a year before. My father asked to say a few words at the ceremony, and I braced myself, remembering old sermons, old certainties. What he said instead surprised everyone in the room, including me. "I spent my whole life afraid of a love I didn't understand," he said, voice unsteady. "My daughter taught me that love was never the dangerous part. Silence was. I dedicate today to my sister Louise," he continued, "who never got the family standing beside her that Dana has today. I'm sorry it took me this long to learn her lesson." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, including Kayla's old coworker Priya, who'd flown in from Nashville just to watch 2 women finally get to be ordinary, unremarkable, happily married. Sloan and I danced our first dance to an old country song she used to hum during slow shifts, the same song that had first made me notice her, years and a lifetime ago. Looking around the room, At my father crying openly. My mother holding Micah's hand. Sloane's fingers laced through mine. I understood that love had never actually been the complicated part. Being honest was the hard part. And I had finally, fully, learned how to do it. Standing in the fever of everything I'd once been too afraid to become. Some fevers break you. This one saved my life. And I would choose it again in every version of myself. In every city. In every hallway. In every version of this story. The end.